Hello students, welcome to lecture 3.2 African Americans and the Civil War. In this lecture, we will focus on the role of the African Americans during the Civil War. So after defining Lincoln's main objective during this war, we will discuss what most African Americans, whether they were free or slaves, what they were thinking about the Civil War, and then we will talk about some of the most important issues concerning the slaves during the war. So we will ask the question of what was the policy of the Union, what was Lincoln's policy, and what was this Emancipation Proclamation all about. Next, toward the end of the lecture, we will talk about the participation of African Americans, whether on the side of the Union or on the side of the Confederate States. First, let's talk about Lincoln's objective during the war. Lincoln's main objective at the beginning of the war was just to preserve the Union. And everything else was just secondary, especially the slave in the South and in the border states. So, following the attack on Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War, he called for 75,000 volunteers in the North to fight the war. And the objective of that was just to preserve the Union. So what did most African Americans think about the war? African Americans, according to many witnesses and documents, understood since the very beginning that the fate of slavery was tied to the outcome of the war, which means that if the North win, then slavery would end. If the South would win, then slavery would continue unabated. So they volunteered by thousands to help the Union to fight the South so that slavery would end it. And while some of the most famous volunteers were the sons of Frederick Douglass himself. So Frederick Douglass sent his 4 sons to fight the war. And these African Americans form their own companies, and sometimes they just have to drill themselves. However, the Union, the Army of Lincoln, did not accept to enlist black volunteers at the beginning. They have to do that after, but at the beginning they rejected the enlistment. How about the Union's policy toward the slaves? The Union's policy was not a coherent policy. They actually did not have any policy at all toward the slaves. So on the battlefields, when the Union Army met with the slaves, they show more concern about the slave owner than the slaves themselves. And actually, the Union General Benjamin Butler coined the term contraband. They use this term contraband to designate the slaves who were running away from their masters in the South. And actually, Congress passed the first Confiscation Act, which means confiscate the contraband, this slave runaway, starting from August 1861. This is to justify the keeping of. So on this drawing, we can see the slaves who were running away from the South toward the Union Army, and as you can see, they were looking for protection from this Union Army. And in fact, the Union Army accept to keep them in the camp, but they use them to do different things in the camps, such as cooking food, carrying heavy equipment. Moreover, concerning the former slaves, Lincoln explored the idea of colonization, which means to send the free slaves either to Africa, to the country of Liberia, or to the Caribbean island of Haiti. In this sense, he invited African American leaders to support this idea of colonization, which means that he didn't really think about keeping African Americans here, but to send them back to Africa or to send them to Haiti. But not many African Americans were interested in this idea. Actually, there are some who went back to Africa. We will talk about that also sometime. But that was on their own, not because of this Lincoln's policy. One of the most important and I would say daring decision made by Lincoln during the Civil War was the Emancipation Proclamation. But before the real Emancipation Proclamation, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd of 1862, which announced that the slaves in the Confederate States, the states still in rebellion, would be free in 100 days. So this is just an announcement, not the real act of Emancipation Proclamation. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the real Emancipation Proclamation, which means that he declared the slaves in the Confederate States, in the state in the South, to be free, starting from January 1st of 1863. However, despite this pompous and term of emancipation, none of the slaves in the South were free by this proclamation. And the simple reason for that was that Lincoln was not in control of these states in the South. So how could he free the slaves in territory that he did not even have? So even though they did not free any slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation actually changed the meaning and the course of the Civil War. Indeed, after the real Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, Lincoln authorized the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. So the decision was motivated not only by the fact that the Union need more people to fight, so they are lacking manpower, but also Lincoln wants to give the opportunity to African Americans to fight for their freedom. So as you can see, Lincoln moved slowly to accept the enlistment. So let's talk about some of the units in which the African Americans were fighting. So the first unit that was formed by black men was the 1st South Carolina Volunteer that was commanded by General Hunter. But this regiment was not really a volunteer because General Hunter used white men to force African Americans to join the regiment. and he trained and drilled the regiment while waiting for authorization and funds from the government. But Congress never authorized the formation of this regiment, so they refused to give him funds. So as a result, the regiment was dispersed at the end of a year. Following the failure of the first South Carolina volunteer, a second South Carolina volunteer was formed and was put under the command of General Rufus Saxton. And actually he gained the approval of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and he revived the first South Carolina volunteer that was commanded by General Hunter. So the second South Carolina volunteer was inducted into the U.S. Army on Emancipation Day on January 1st, 1863, near Carolina. But the most important and famous unit in which African Americans were fighting was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This regiment was formed exclusively of black men from the North, and it was put under the command of Robert Gouldshaw, a Harvard graduate, and he was, even though he was not an active abolitionist, Shaw was determined to prove that African Americans were good fighters. So he tried to prove that African Americans would fight this war. So on this painting we can see the members of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment during the Second Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. And as you can see, there are brown faces and two. If you look carefully, you would see recognize two white faces. One of the most important issues during the war was about racial discrimination. So not only African Americans were discriminated because they have to fight in segregated unit, they were not fighting alongside the white men, but they were fighting in segregated units, but they also were paid at lower scale compared to their white counterpart. So a white private would earn $13 per month, whereas a black private would earn only $10. So they protested this discrimination, and in the end Congress enacted a compromise, but most of these African Americans were not satisfied. On the battlefield, African Americans also suffer disproportionately more casualties. They were not treated as regular soldiers by the Confederate soldiers. So when they were captured on the battlefield, they are regularly massacred, murdered by the Confederate soldiers instead of being taken as prisoners of war, as the rule would require them to do. And the worst atrocity committed against African American soldiers occurred at Port Pillow in Tennessee on April 12, 1864. During this battle, Confederate soldiers under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the man who created the KKK, slaughtered 300 black soldiers and their white commanders. So that was a crime of war. If you In addition to serving as soldiers, some African Americans were also serving as liberators, freeing black slaves in the South. They also served as spies and even guides during the Civil War. So the most famous among these liberators, spies, and guides were Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls himself was a slave in South Carolina, in Charleston, but he managed to liberate himself and 15 other slaves, and they stole from the port of Charleston a Confederate ship by the name of the Planter. So Smalls and his friends stole this ship and brought it to the Union Army in the North. Another famous African Americans who really worked hard during the Civil War was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman organized a spy ring to help the Union Army, and at the same time she also helped to free nearly 800 slaves. So beyond the battlefield, some white people in the North were having issue with the draft. So this is the first time also that people were drafted to serve in the military. So as a result, angry New Yorker Irishmen beat and lynched black men they saw on the streets in July of 1863. So that was called the draft riots of New York. Yeah. But the rich people in the North were able to avoid the draft. They were actually exempted. One question that many people were asking about the participation of African Americans during the Civil War was, did African Americans fought on the side of the Confederate States? So that's a question that most people ask then, and still today. People still wonder whether there were African Americans on the side of the Confederate soldiers. Actually, the Confederate states used black people, but not as soldiers. So the Confederate military needed manpower. So they used black slaves in camps to do different things, to cook and to haul heavy equipment, but not as soldiers, as some people would argue. In addition to that, the Confederate government asked and then compelled the slave owner to contribute the slaves to the Confederate military. So they passed this law called 20 Nigger Law, which means that if a slave owner gave to the Confederate state 20 slaves, then this person would be exempted from the draft. But this law infuriated the poor. So that concluded this lecture on African Americans and the Civil War. Please move to lecture 3.3 to continue on